Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We have been looking forward to tonight's live Q&A and discussion for quite some time. Hopefully, if you're here tonight, you have taken the time to go watch that free screening link that we've put out there for Langston Hughes' Ask Your Mama, 12 Moods for Jazz. That was put together by Dr. Ronald C. McCurdy and the Ron McCurdy Quartet. And he is here tonight with Dr. Neal Lester of ASU, and they're going to be taking your questions about Langston Hughes and that work. If you have not watched it, that link will be live until March 21st, and you can watch the piece or go back and watch it again if you'd like at tinyurl.com/askyourmama, and the password is LHP 2021. That is a wonderful homage in verse and music to the struggle for artistic and social freedom at home and abroad in the 1960s. So if you are a fan of Hughes' work or really just want to learn more about it tonight and its great relevance even now in 2021, you're going to want to stay around for this discussion, and please do share it with anybody that might be missing it right now. Your questions will be driving this discussion, so we really, really hope to hear from you in the chat, or if you have comments, our guests will be seeing those, and hopefully they'll be able to incorporate those into the discussion. Tonight, we have Dr. Ronald C. McCurdy. Once again, he did put this work together, brought it to life when this work had not been performed at the death of Langston Hughes. So he really took it and made a multimedia performance with it. Normally, this is something we would have brought to the venue in person, and this actually was performed in person at ASU Care some years ago with local legend Charles Lewis on the piano. Dr. Ronald C. McCurdy is professor of music in the Thornton School of Music at USC. He's past president of the International Association for Jazz Education. Prior to his appointment at USC, he served as the director of the Thelonious Monk Institute of Jazz at USC. He's the director of the National Grammy Vocal Jazz Ensemble and Combo, and also serves as director of the Walt Disney All-American College Band in Anaheim, California. He's released quite a lot of music, played with many jazz greats, and he is an artist with the Yamaha Music Corporation. Dr. Neal Lester, a favorite at ASU, and he is definitely a friend of CARE, and we've enjoyed having him here at the venue many times. He is Foundation Professor of English and founding director of the multiple award-winning Project Humanities Initiative at ASU. That's an initiative that brings together individuals and communities to talk, listen, and connect. Dr. Lester has authored or edited 7 books and has just completed an edited volume on global social justice across professions and disciplines. His research centers on African-American literature and culture, including Black masculinities, privilege and bias, cultural appropriation, American popular culture, the N-word, and children's literature. He is a very popular keynote speaker, discussion facilitator, media interviewee, blogger, and op-ed writer. We are so honored to welcome Dr. Ronald C. McCurdy and Dr. Neal Lester.
Good evening, old friend.
Good to see you. How are you?
Well, as Langston Hughes might say, I'm still here.
And you're looking good too, I might add.
I'm still looking. Thank you for inviting me to participate in a conversation. This feels like we've come full circle in one sense.
That's true. We were talking before we came on air that we were with you back in 2011, I think it was.
Which, yes, that's when Project Humanities launched. And in fact, 2021 is our 10th anniversary year.
Oh my goodness.
In this day and age, that speaks volumes about the resilience of humanities work and the need for us to continue for another 20, 30 years.
Well, congratulations to you. I know you've been the catalyst for making it happen. So kudos to you and your team.
Thank you. So how are we going to kick this off tonight?
Well, maybe we should talk a little bit about how the work came to be.
Okay.
So I can just start if you want to prompt me.
Well, let me prompt you, because I discovered right before this that I get to play Oprah Winfrey right this moment, and we'll see if people will be talking about this the way they were talking about that other interview. I think they will, because we bring an added dose of something here. You know, you and I met in 2011. We just said that this is our 10th anniversary, and I asked you before coming on, you know, when did you first do this? And you mentioned 1995. And my question for you to kind of kick this conversation off is, what keeps you connected to this work after so many years? And then we can go perhaps in some of the history of it.
Yes. Well, you know, in the spirit of jazz is about the not knowing. And a jazz musician can play the same tune night after night, and every night it's going to be different. You know, as we talk about the whole African diaspora and how music derived from the motherland, in Africa, as it is with African American music, the music is about the performer and not the composer, by comparison to Western art music, to African derived music. So it's about, so the artist has the opportunity to personalize, if you will, every time you perform something. And we can look at examples all throughout history, whether it be Ella Fitzgerald doing the Great American Songbook, singing the music of George Gershwin. Gershwin wrote the music, but when Ella went, the way you wear your hat, the way you sip your tea,
Right,
it became her song.
Yes.
And the same thing is true when Marvin Gaye sang the national anthem.
Yes.
I am certain that Francis Scott Key did not have that in mind.
Or Aretha Franklin and Amazing Grace.
Okay, exactly.
Yes,
exactly.
I hear you.
So what with me with this work is it's such a cerebral work, and it's so densely written. It's like a Picasso or painting or a Romero Bearden painting. Every time you look at it, you see something different, or you hear something different. So for me, this is what energizes me. I mean, right now we can't do it live like we would normally have done, and but I just every time I perform it, it's a new experience for me.
But you know, in many ways, that reminds me of why we revisit whatever classics we consider the classics.
Yeah.
We visit them not because they've changed, but somehow our experiences have changed. And what we bring to it today wasn't necessarily what we brought to it 10 years ago when we first came together. And that to me seems the excitement that I witness when I watch you do it, and I hear you doing it, and I hear you speaking to that now with that sense of, you know, I taught Intozaki Shange today and for colored girls, and that was that sense of what you see tonight may not be what you see tomorrow, but you'll hear something that should move you. Yeah. And that's what this piece does for me as I listen to you play it, but also as you recite it.
I was thinking about the one line that happens in Mood 1 when he goes, dreams and nightmares, nightmares and dreams, dreaming that the Negroes of the South have taken over, voted all the Dixiecrats right out of power. Comes the colored hour. And I thought about the two senators from Georgia.
Yes.
You know, Martin Luther King.
Yes.
So current events, social events, political events, those things kind of, they sort of accentuate certain aspects of the poem that didn't resonate with me, and I always enjoyed it, but certain sections seem to have a different kind of meaning now than what they had last year, 2 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yes. Well, even that waiting motif, you know, telling people to wait. We need you to wait because now is not the time. You're like, well, when is the time? When is the time for justice? Because this is 400 years past due. And this notion of gradualism was not something that Langston Hughes, at least in my reading of this, and your performance, was not something that he settled for either, that there was an urgency in this.
Yes.
That go ahead.
And he used that leitmotif from W.C. Handy, Hesitation Blues.
Yes.
How long must I wait?
How long must I wait?
Can I get it now or must I hesitate?
Right. Well, and remember James Baldwin, because I see you have that in the back there. I am not your Negro. He says that also. He says, I critique America because I love her, but America hasn't always loved me back. So I think that metaphor that you brought up about in your introduction to the piece is that's totally appropriate. Is sort of waiting, but this is a relationship and we should be giving each other mutually. And I don't know if historically America has given to marginalized communities as a given to other communities. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And that's one reason why this poem is so relevant today.
Okay.
I mean, some of the same fights that we're fighting in 2021, we fought in the 1960s. We fought during Jim Crow.
Right.
We fought during emancipation. I mean, some of the same battles that we find ourselves engaged in now are still happening. So how long must we wait?
Well, like what though? Because there's some people who, I mean, I was born in the 60s, but I don't know if there's a lot of folks listening to us who know anything about what we're talking about. In fact, people who look like us with the gray beards, people would say, well, you know, we have evolved. We have had a Black president, something we couldn't even imagine when we were growing up. So how does this resonate with those folks who actually don't actually see what people have lived through? How would you address that?
That's a very good question. And I think one of the things that we have to do, which is why I love this work so much, is to educate people, because some things, I know my son takes for granted.
Right.
Now, I grew up in the South, and I'm one of those gray beards right now. And I remember moments when there was distinct redlining. Right. I remember where we couldn't go to certain schools because of our ethnic background. We couldn't go into, we had to sit in certain parts of the bus. Right. I remember those moments. I mean, I'm that old.
Right.
So, and we have made progress. The fact that you and I are professors at distinguished universities, you know, this wouldn't have happened 50 years ago.
Right.
Like to consider this. So we have made progress, but I think there's somewhat of a chasm between the haves and the have-nots. I mean, there's a huge gap.
Right.
And this is what I think. I mean, we can see some of the remnants of slavery, where many of our brothers and sisters haven't had an opportunity.
Right.
And this is where I think for our young people, particularly those who are thinking, well, what's the problem? Like you said, we've had a Black president, we've got a Black vice president. So shut up. What's the problem?
Who's female now? Right. Right.
So I mean, and I have the same issue, you know, with as we talk about, you know, diversity, equity, and equality. And inclusivity. I remember there was a quote, I forget who said it, but it said diversity is being invited to the party, and equity and inclusivity is being asked to dance.
Yeah, I think that's Verna Myers. I think a diversity leader out there said something like that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I see this in higher education. I see this in corporate America. I see this, I mean, in places where we are just we're not quite welcome yet, you know?
Well, and it's interesting because from my perspective, we can certainly talk about that and not play the victim card, but to look at our American history in a way that is more comprehensive than some of the histories that my guess you were fed and I was fed. Yes. And I think that in many ways, when I asked that question, it was sort of a trick question, because I don't know that people ask that when we are studying Shakespeare or when we're studying Milton or we're just studying any of the other folks. It's like, how is that relevant now? We just accept that without questioning it. And I think in many ways, this piece really educates. I mean, I'm glad that you provided in the study guide, like these annotations. Now, some folks would have said, just let people go look at it. But you were a kind professor type who said, here are some annotations. That's part of the education process. We're not just studying stuff that was written, created yesterday. We're studying stuff in the past so that we see the extent, at least from my perspective, where the past is also part of the present, especially if we talk about race relations in this country.
Yes. And I'll tell you, as I crafted the music for this work, because when Langston, and maybe
go ahead into the history of that. Yeah.
Langston had planned to collaborate with Charles Mingus and Randy Weston, as he had done with Charles Mingus with a piece called The Weary Blues years earlier. And unfortunately, Langston Hughes passed away before they had a chance to realize work as they had intended. So as I was composing the music for this work, I had to go back and really do my homework to figure out who was. I mean, a lot of people names I recognize, but there were some I did not. And so I had to do my homework because I didn't want to just be reciting names and not have any idea who I was talking about. So, but Langston had the uncanny ability to write in such a way that regardless of your academic prowess, you could relate and understand most of his work. Now, this work was quite cerebral. I mean, this was grown people's work. This was not for children. This is adult literature here.
I'm glad you said that. Yes, yes. I'm glad you said that. Yes.
And so I just, like I said, every time I perform it, I'm hearing something, and I perform it differently. I mean, certain times I'll have certain inflections that I wouldn't have just because of how I feel. I mean, I'll feel differently on Monday than I might feel on Wednesday. And that's in the work, yes. And
that's interesting to me, because you're absolutely right on when you talk about putting this in the context of a tradition that is not a Western tradition. And I think that may be one of the reasons that Langston Hughes is probably one of the brightest stars during the Harlem Renaissance, is because there was this effort, you know, in that 20-year span, roughly 1918, as many of you know, to 1937, where there was this flourishing and blossoming of new Negro. And this is getting away from the melodrama and the stereotypes and the caricatures and the step and fetch it and that stereotype from Dixie. You know, I wish I was in the land of cotton, or the minstrel songs like Polly Wolly Doodle and Jim Crack Corn and all those things that we now know as Disney tunes. I'm just going to say that under my breath. That are written in that dialect that did not intend to bring any sort of dignity to folks, but to do just the opposite. Yeah. And for him to sort of come out and say, you know, we can have fun with this, but we can also teach people and also challenge people, is one of the greatest contributions that I see that he has made in that whole galaxy of people who were excellent. Who were excellent and making all these wonderful contributions, both in, well, not both, but in poetry, in music, in fashion,
visual arts.
In art, visual arts, and for him to sort of emerge this way. Absolutely. So that to me is exciting. And it didn't necessarily mean that the racism went away, because Jim Crow was still happening during that period of 1918 and 37. But it shows that one does not necessarily have to be defined by the cage if the caged bird continues to sing. Absolutely. And that metaphor seems really appropriate for what we see in what is, you know, it's both cerebral, but it's also accessible, though. To have something that is both of that is really kind of a challenge. So, you know, we can look up stuff and still enjoy the music without having to intellectualize it in such a way that it teases all the energy out of it. Teases all the energy.
I think people might want to know, where did the Ask Your Mama come from? I mean, what does that have to do with anything? And if people haven't seen the introduction, Langston, I mean, he engages this sort of verbal sparring that we find very much a part of the African community and how people interact with one another. And in this particular case, Langston, as we know, had reached a certain level of acclaim. He had won all kinds of awards, had traveled all over the world, was doing wonderful things, internationally recognized. But his white friends would say, "Langston, that's wonderful what you've done, but can you recommend a maid?" And he would look in just disbelief. "I can't believe you just asked me, can I recommend a maid?" And his retort would be, "Yeah, I can recommend a maid. Your mama can be the maid." So we know, for those who don't understand, mama jokes, that's what this was about. Yeah. And Langston was just, he brought that kind of satirical flavor to this work, right, that lightened it up at times. And other times he was very serious. He would call certain people out. He would call out even Black folks who moved up to Sugar Hill, right, to get away from the other Black folks. Yep. Too many Negroes, even for the Negroes. Yep. So he just, this is a masterpiece. This is an absolute masterpiece. And like I said, I will perform this until I cannot perform anymore, because I thought for sure that this was going to be a one and done situation. In fact, I'll tell that story as well. We when I was a professor at the University of Minnesota at the time, there was a museum being erected called the Weizmann Art Museum, and the curator was going to have a Harlem Renaissance theme. She had invited Jacob Lawrence and his wife to be the guest speakers, and she asked
famous painter.
Yes. Asked if we could put together a program that would be appropriate for the theme. And we said, absolutely. And we forgot about it. And we saw her about we saw her about a month before the event. She said, Dr. McCurdy, how's that program coming along? And I went, oops, yes, great. And I scurried back to my office, and we kind of put this together. And we had virtually no rehearsals. We had one of those slide machine with a carousel propped up on phone books.
Yeah.
And as we were playing, because the musicianship was very high, I was looking out into the audience, and I could see that people were really enjoying this. But it was an academic presentation. And at the time, my colleague was doing the reciting of the poem, and he was a little. I mean, I love him, but he was a little, in the quarter of the Negroes, where the doors are doors of paper dust of dingy atoms. It was like watching grass grow. That's how I said that, but it was rather dry.
Okay.
And but I could still see the potential.
Right.
In this work. So as time progressed, and this was in 1995. The next year, Amiri Baraka came to the Walker Theater in Minneapolis, and he asked us to open for him. And
my goodness.
Yeah, we did some of the movements for Amiri Baraka.
Who used to be Leroy Jones, for those who don't know that. Yep.
Blues
playwright, poet, 1960s, revolution.
Yes. And we were so honored to have to do that, have that opportunity to open for him. And he enjoyed the work. Now we know he and Langston had a little bit of there was a little kerfuffle.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
And, because by the time he came along, he thought Langston had become rather passé.
Oh, okay.
But at the time of this work was not passé at all. I mean, this work was written in 1960. But anyway, it was an honor for us to do it. And then we kept doing it, and people kept asking us to do it.
Right.
And here we are, some 20 plus years later.
Wow. That's an accomplishment. You know what I noticed is in watching the production that we all were invited to watch, but at a certain point, the audience becomes part of that when you're asking the question, or you're presenting the rhythm as if you're presenting a joke. And they know the punchline. That to me shows that, first of all, they're paying attention and they get what's going. You may not know all the pieces, but when you get to that point about, can you tell me something about where you got that patio, or can you tell me where I
got my money?
Or can you ask where you got, all of those kinds of ask your became. They asked me at Thanksgiving if I voted for Nixon, and I said I voted for your mama, right? And see, those who are on the outside, because this isn't inside outside. It's sort of like gossip and playing the dozens, which you see in movies. White Men Can't Jump. I talk about this in Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God. These Yo Mama jokes were actually jokes that were about storytelling and verbal gymnastics. And as you rightfully point out in the introduction, this was actually derived from a real insult to those who were enslaved being forcibly brought to this country, but in such physical states that they sometimes could not command their worth individually. So they would lump them together and sell them as a dozen, like a dozen eggs or a dozen donuts. That was not something to be proud of. Nobody wanted to be sold like that. I mean, if you're going to be sold, you want to be sold. But there was a way in which you could take that back and take all of that negativity that's been associated with Blackness and turn it on its head. And that your mama could be your daddy, your sister, your brother, anybody, and we would go to places like Blackness, because that was negative, or go to poor or stupid. And I'm putting that in air quotes because the ableist stuff. But somebody on the outside, if they heard somebody saying, Professor McCurdy, oh, they're in there talking about their mamas. Well, they're not really talking about their mamas. And they wouldn't be talking about your mama if your mama's in a wheelchair. You wouldn't say your mama's in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
That's not worth joking any more than you got an A on your paper. That's not worth gossiping about. But if you could talk about your mama and then you wait for that other rhythm, then that becomes a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And everybody can't do that. That's the artistry of this. Everybody can't do it.
Well, I will say this about Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was not a musician himself, but he loved being around musicians.
Yes.
And I will tell you that on any given night, you could find Langston Hughes on 52nd Street, listening to Eubie Blake, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Nina Simone, whoever was performing, he would be there.
Right.
And I think because he loved music, he wasn't a musician, but this particular poem has a certain rhythmic cadence to it.
Right.
A jazz cadence.
Yep.
There's one line that goes, bare feet to beat the great drum beat, and glory to your name, and mine were the same. You barefoot too, in the quarter of the Negroes. You know, bare feet to beat the great drum beat. Bump, bump, go. That's jazz.
Right, right.
That's the rhythm that you would use in a composition, you know?
Well, and I love the fact that, because I, in that spectrum, I'm kind of a blues guy, but I know that there's a moment when the blues and the jazz start to crisscross and they don't come as separate, but that moment of, I too sing America.
Yeah.
What happens to a dream deferred? A Negro speaks of rivers. All of that can come out of a blues tradition that is not about melancholy, but it's about having voice and giving voice to those who would otherwise be silenced.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that some of the people who are mentioned here, because that to me is where the education piece comes, and for me as well, is looking at, well, who is he referencing? And why is he being so specific? Well, I don't know if we ask that question of Shakespeare. When Shakespeare is making references, we go look for them.
Yeah.
That's how we become part of the education and not having it sort of just spoon fed to us. Somebody's asking about, when did you first read Langston Hughes, and do you remember what you read first?
My father was a high school principal.
Oh, okay.
And he was an English major. He taught English before becoming a principal.
Right.
And he would have my siblings and I, we would have oratorical contests.
Oh my. Okay.
I mean, my father was that serious about being able to speak well. And I remember as early as 5 and 6 years old, the Negro speaks of rivers. I've known rivers. I mean, I remember having to recite that as a kid. Now, at that time, I had no idea that this would become part of my life's work. Right. And my mother taught third grade. So, I mean, we always were reading poems and reading literature, and like you said, Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston, Arnold Bontemps. I mean, we always were just immersed in the history, because when we went to school, they were not teaching African American history. We were basically erased from the history books.
Right. Yep.
No black writers, no black musicians, no black literary artists. I mean, none of that was part of the canon that we were taught while we were in school. So my parents made sure that we got that.
Did you have black teachers?
Black teachers, yeah. Well, funny, good question. My senior year in high school is finally when Brown versus the Board of Education came to our town. And the way integration worked in the South, where I grew up, the principals and most of the teachers were either fired or demoted. And the majority of the teachers were white. So you had white teachers teaching black kids, and these implicit and, dare I say, explicit biases were on full display, because their mindset was, these poor little black kids are incapable of learning. So we're gonna just show videos and we're gonna kind of dummy things down because they're incapable of digesting information. So basically my senior year was a wash. For lack of a better term. I mean,
well, that's interesting. That's interesting that you mentioned that, because I just finished a piece on what we call curriculum violence now, which is the ways in which still to this day, 80% of the teachers in the USA are still white and female. And you can see time after time these pedagogical missteps of folks not knowing how to talk about race and also not knowing how to teach race in such a way that does harm or disruption to that typically Black or brown child's learning environment. And it's anything from the N-word to a simulation game to something that I just stumbled upon, slavery yoga. Slavery yoga, where you teach history of slavery through yoga poses. And that happened as of this year. So there's still a whole lot of work to to be done relative to race and talking about race and education. So my first one was mother to son. Life for me ain't been no crystal stair. And some of those we had to memorize, but somebody always, and when you did oratory at my church, somebody would always do a Langston Hughes poem because they were safe. They didn't have any language that you had to censor the way we'd have to do some of that. So do you want to address that? Colleen is asking about Langston Hughes' international travel and how that impacted his work. And then are we returning to a time of the poet with Amanda Gorman?
Yeah, well, we know that Langston Hughes was a world traveler. He was a Renaissance man. He spent time down in Mexico where his father was living. He spent time in, of course, in Europe, South America. And everywhere he went, he had, again, the ability to extract stories from what he observed. And that became part of his, the content for his poems. There's references to Bahia.
Yep.
I think it's in Mood 7, where he talks about, so in Orgun. So all those experiences manifested themselves in his work because, like I said, he was a world traveler. I mean, and he had the ability to, like most artists, to see the world differently than most people do. For a musician to hear a train go by, that's a rhythm. Or to hear birds chirping, that's melody. For an artist to look at a sunset or a sunrise, that's something on a canvas. For Langston Hughes, he just observed life. He just observed people interacting. You know?
Well, and I find also that you didn't necessarily have to travel in order to be aware of what's happening in the world, because you could be aware of Toussaint Louverture and Haiti or Castro in Cuba and never having gone there, but you're aware that there are sisters and brothers who are united through the diaspora and know that what that struggle is there in some way connects with the struggle that is going on here. And because, not everybody can travel, not everybody has the resources for that. But yes, I think that in the same way that Ntozake Shange writes about all these different places, because there is a unified struggle, and that struggle continues to be against white supremacy and what we are now calling systemic racism and anti-Blackness that is global. That is global. It's not just here in Arizona, not just here in the USA. Amanda Gorman set people on fire. In fact, that was all many people were talking about in my circles after that inauguration. So are we returning to a time of the poet?
I don't think we ever left the poet.
That would be my response also.
Yeah, I don't think we ever left the poets. I mean, the poets have always been with us. I think because she was someone who was so young, so brilliant, so eloquent in her speech and her how she comported herself. And I think and so spot on. The one line that resonated with me, in fact, many of them did, but this particular line really connected with me when she said that there were some who would rather destroy democracy than share it. And this was, just a few days after January 6th.
In that very spot.
In that very same spot, where we saw people with Confederate flags and, 6 million were not enough.
Swastikas
and all the things.
Or Auschwitz.
Yeah, and people were saying, well, this was not a racial issue. And I remind people, that our last president was very good at stoking white grievance and white fear. And this is something that's really kind of taken from the playbook of the early planters during the 16th century, at a time when people were recognized by their nationality and not by their so-called whiteness, which was a social construct. You were Swede, you were Polish, you were German, you were Spanish, but you weren't white. There was no such thing as whiteness. But to have this divide and conquer dynamic, to convince those poor Europeans who came who were in the same boat as that first parcel who came from Africa. They were all indentured servants. They were all being exploited, but they had to figure out a way to divide and conquer, to convince those poor whites, we're not going to give you any land, we're not going to give you any money, but you get to be part of the white club. And we see examples of that with the Civil War. We know that most whites didn't own enslaved Africans, but they were convinced to pick up arms to fight to preserve the right for the wealthy ones to maintain slavery. We saw examples with the Affordable Care Act. Poor whites who never had any health insurance in their lives had a chance to help. I hate Obamacare. Now, why would you vote against your own best
interest? Now you're making it all political. Now you're making it all political. Now, right?
I'm trying to give examples of.
No, I hear what you're saying. I'm not mad at you for bringing that up. It does remind us though that the issues, because even in the poem itself, it references Jim Crow. It references moving into certain kinds of neighborhoods and not necessarily being welcome. And that's what I love about the fact that you provided these images. Because even if you didn't know these names, you were able to create a slideshow. And I've seen this happen live where it's sort of, you may not recognize a name, but there's an image up there and you can go look at, when it says Ella Fitzgerald or Pearl Bailey or any of the myriad others, you got an image up there. Yeah. And you've got people so that it's not just something abstract, but actually very concrete. So I appreciate the fact that you bring all those elements to the sort of multimodal aspects of this to sort of remind us that we are not single issue or single, dimensions, that we are I was just today quoting a piece talking about we're not single issue folks, Audre Lorde says, and we are multidisciplinary. Those from, not from a Western tradition where music and song and poetry can all come together. And I'll add one more thing in addressing the Amanda Gorman. We have had spoken word. Mm-hmm. We have had Black preachers up in pulpits. That's where the poetry is. The poetry wasn't necessarily sitting down and only listening to Phyllis Wheatley. It was listening to those uneducated Black preachers who could make people shout all over the church by looking at the Bible and creating a story that resonated on some level. Yeah. Or create the Negro spiritual, which is simply, sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child a long way from home. That's poetry. That's poetry.
I was thinking about the senator from Georgia, Reverend Warnoff, who spoke yesterday, I think it was. Yes. And I'm not sure people saw that, but seldom do senators receive a standing ovation at the end of a speech on the Senate floor.
Right.
And he was so eloquent and how he spoke and how he told us, to me, that was poetry. Yeah. Poetry in motion.
Yeah. Yeah. And even sometimes the rhythms, I even say, the rhythm of the Yo Mama jokes is a kind of poetry. Mm-hmm. It has a certain kind of rhythm in it. And if you miss because poetry is about rhythm. Yeah. And if you miss the rhythm, it's sort of like telling a joke. You've heard somebody tell jokes. I've been one of those. And you're not a joke teller, so you kind of miss the beat. And then you say something like, oh, you should have been there. So that to me is the art form that is part of this tradition that is both oral and it's grounded and it's blues and it's jazz and it's cerebral and it's all of those things and fundamentally about race.
Yeah.
And fundamentally about humanity and the Declaration for Humanity. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. I'm curious, when you've done this so many times, thankfully, I'm curious as to where audiences tend to go in a discussion. What resonates with audiences? And you've probably had so many diverse audiences see that. What are maybe two of the top two things that audiences want to talk about when they've seen this live?
Well, I think a lot of people, first, let me back up just a second.
Okay.
I want to distinguish entertainment from art.
Okay.
Entertainment, in my thinking, is a way of offering some degree of distraction from the vicissitudes of everyday life. Art causes an audience to focus on life. So my thinking is, with this particular work, I want people to leave the concert really re-evaluating their own core values, reassessing who they are, what do they stand for. So, we've got all kinds of questions. There are some questions about how we put the whole thing together, but then people will ask me, how do you do this? How do you keep this fresh? How do you do this night after night and still presented with such conviction and such gusto. And I asked them, I turned around, I said, well, how did this work make you feel? They said, and some I felt guilty. Like our white artists, I felt kind of guilty. And I need to be a better person. I need to say something. And I would always say, your silence is your complicity. That is the worst. Silence is the worst ally that will not allow us to move forward. In other words, as John Lewis said, when you see something, you got to say something. And I think a lot of people who at one point felt, well, this is not, I don't have a dog in this fight. This is not, it's not, I mean, I live in a nice neighborhood. It's safe. There's no crime. I don't have a problem. But I think people leave the concert really reevaluating and realizing that if my neighbor, if my brother or my sister, if they're hurting, then I have a fiduciary responsibility to engage. So that message has really resonated with me. I mean, I really appreciated hearing that from our audiences. Yeah, that's one thing that I think that I've been able.
And is that the difference between white audience members and Black audience members, or have you not seen a distinction there?
Oh yeah, big distinction. I mean, I think.
Okay, can you allude to that briefly?
Oh my goodness. Well, we recorded this. The recording that we have of this work, we recorded it at the Huntington Library here in Los Angeles, and we had a very diverse audience that night. I would say it was probably 65, 35 in terms of Black versus white. So the Black folks were quite vocal that night. They got it. I mean, they understood. I mean, you can hear them in the background, you know, anticipating what's about to happen. And I often get people who are our age, maybe a little older, say, you know, I used to live in Harlem. They recognize some of the images. They remember the name Adam Clayton Powell riding in his Jaguar. You know, they remember certain aspects of Sugar Hill. So for them, it's a moment to reminisce and to think back of what life was like in the 1940s and 50s when we didn't quite matter.
Right.
You know, I mean, think about it. I mean, we didn't have, I mean, democracy didn't really happen for everyone until the Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964. I mean, and even then, having you can't legislate people's hearts.
Right.
I mean, we had the law, but it didn't all of a sudden, you know, flick a switch, and all of a sudden people begin to embrace African Americans. But I think people, you know, young people, I tell them, you know, this work is designed to inspire you to do further research. This work will not give you all the answers, but this work will give you just enough to whet your appetite, hopefully, that will inspire you to not walk, but run to the library to do further investigation. And that's kind of our mission with this work.
Well, I just want to make that distinction, because when you started saying people feel guilty, I'm like, well, who's actually feeling guilty and why?
Yeah,
that's not unlike conversations that we're having now about racial justice since George Floyd's murder. Is there's a frenzy to do all this sort of anti-racist work, but there's you know, we do book clubs, and we do you know, listening sessions, and we create diversity positions, but those things alone will not address systemic stuff. And this work resonates because it's about systemic stuff, but it's about the ways in which these things coexist, that Black folks can still create, can still thrive, even at the time stuff being stolen through cultural appropriation. So Michael has a question for you.
Hey, let's see.
Can you see it there?
Dr. McCurdy, while first creating this project and continuing to perform it over years and years, continue to evolve it through having new insights or influences. Well, one thing, the words don't change. I mean, the actual text has not changed, obviously. I mean, we're not going to take Langston Hughes' words and change them. But like I said, events that surround them will amplify certain sections of the work to me, or will resonate to me in a way that it had not done prior to events. Like for example, the murder of George Floyd. Now, we haven't had a chance to perform this live since George Floyd was murdered, but I can guarantee you the next time we do this live, it will be different than what it was the last time we performed. Like now, I'll tell you this: what you guys saw right now, we didn't have a quality performance of this work on that was high definition and good sound quality. So I pulled my band together, and we recorded we recorded this work this summer in July down in Carlsbad, and have a beautiful theater down there. And we had to do without an audience. And there was no audience there. I mean, we had. I mean, but through the magic of technology,
I was going to say, wait, did you have a laugh track there? Because I heard some people in the audience doing stuff.
It wasn't a laugh track, but what we did, we took the response from our CD of the work, and I had my engineer listen to the CD and extract the audience's response to give the illusion that there was a live audience there.
Oh, now we're peeking behind the curtain now.
I shouldn't be giving with my
I was going to say, see, and I just said that. I said that earlier. I was like, and the audience was right with you because they know exactly when to respond to that. But we're going to pretend we don't know that because we're going to go ahead and enjoy it the way it is.
Well, they did because, like I said, we took the response from the audience from our live CD.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, right.
It wasn't manufacturing. It was exactly what people did at that moment. I mean, it took us 2 days to extract. I wanted every shout, every applaud, every whatever happened. I wanted that to be in our recorded version that we did this summer.
Well, it was nicely done and seamless, at least from my untrained ear perspective.
Because the thing is, this work, I mean, it's just like church. I mean, imagine a preacher at a good old Baptist church winding down his sermon.
Right. Or hers.
Or her sermon.
Yes.
And she's saying, Moses, let my people go. Bam. There has to be a call and response between the preacher, the organist, and the congregation.
Yes.
Imagine a preacher doing that.
Yes.
Without an organist or without a congregation.
Yes. Well, and that's what a lot of preachers are experiencing now, though, because of with all the sort of Zooming and the virtual stuff. And I noticed that they're planting about a handful of people socially distanced in some of the churches, so you can get that live response.
You got to have that.
You got to have, because that feeds the energy, you know, and it also gives the preacher some time to breathe. And if you've got the piano calling and responding to it, and you got all that noise happening, then that creates the frenzy that W.E. Boyd talks about in The Souls of Black Folks. That's what you see. I experienced parts of that when we're listening and watching you do that. So you've been able to create that.
It was not easy.
Well, congratulations.
We had to imagine there being an audience there.
Right.
And it was so eerie because it was a beautiful theater. It held about 500 seats.
Right.
And there was one person there. My manager was sitting in the back row, and she didn't say a word.
Oh.
And
that is not helpful when you need a response.
So
that is not
thinking, like, as I introduced the group, I'm introducing everybody while the talk was still going on.
Right. Well, and that's interesting because, you know, we have that fourth wall for a lot of traditional theater that's Western, and we imagine that we're supposed to sit quietly, but that's exactly what you don't want in these kinds of experiences. You want people yelling out and shouting and doing all this because they're with you and they're agreeing with you. You've got one saying, have you created other projects similar to, that sounds like that's from Lisa Chow, from this work that will be presented anytime soon?
You know what, I am, the Lord has blessed me to be creative. And I live my life. I travel, you know, as it was safe to travel, and I interact with a lot of people. I was in Columbia, South Carolina about 5 years ago, and there was a display of some beautiful images by a photographer by the name of Richard Samuel Roberts. Okay. He was a custodian by day at the post office, but his passion was photography. And what he did, when he died, he was there from 1920 to 1936 in Columbia. He had amassed about 3,000 portraits. And when he died in 1936, they put all the negatives in boxes, put it beneath his house, and they sat there for another 50 years. His grandson discovered them. The museum got wind of it. They did a display, an exhibition of his work. I'm there doing my Langston Hughes Project, and I'm seeing these images, and I'm saying, who are these people? This is beautiful photography. So right. we don't really know because he didn't label who they were. And I said, well, you all haven't told the whole story.
Right.
I said, well, what do you have in mind, Dr. McCurdy? I said, well, let me take maybe 10 of these subjects and see if I can't craft a fictional narrative about their lives. There was one woman who posed in her domestic uniform. Her story was she got up every morning at 5 o'clock to go across town to take care of somebody else's children, while her 5 children were left unattended, all for
Yep.
$2 a week.
Yep. Yep.
You know,
Yep.
so we turned it into another hybrid multimedia presentation, and this is more dramatic arts, more actors, images. I wrote the music. We had a videographer, and we tell stories. So for me, I love telling stories about our people because we are so resilient.
A quick question about the images you mentioned. Will the images change as experiences change, or the images are pretty much the same consistently?
Well, this is our 4th iteration of images.
Oh, okay.
And so I think as time does change, I mean, for example, the first time we did it, we had it was like watching MTV. They were going by so fast, they were almost distracting.
I'm glad we didn't see that part of it, right?
Yeah. So I got rid of that, and we had some other images. And now the ones that we have now, we've had them for about maybe 3 years.
Okay.
So it may be time for us to maybe go back and re-examine, because I like to try and connect the historical dots and show the nexus between Emmett Till and George Floyd.
Yep. That's what I was about to say, because that has impacted us globally. And so It felt like that was like the next iteration of what you're going to do. There's another question from Colleen. What do you say to African-American parents of young college students who want to study poetry and jazz as opposed to the push today for STEM?
Well, as an art, I always say this. People who choose to do the art, they do so not because they want to, but because they have to. In my case, like I said, my father was a high school principal. He thought music was something that you do for fun. And he was right. I've been having fun for 40 years. But he said, son, that's not a job. That's not an occupation. That's not a real occupation. And he said, if you go to school to major in music, I'm not paying for that. And guess what? He didn't.
And I'll add to that is I don't know that necessarily we have to think in terms of binaries, either or. I think people who are scientists enjoy music and arts and reading Shakespeare. So I think what we could do as parents is encourage people to do what their passions are leading them to do. And we don't have to either or the way we have tried to do it. If we could get out of binary thinking, then potentially people could be freer to do a little of both. You can do political science and be an artist. And that, because your whole life doesn't have to be what you've studied. Your life can be what you do and who you are. So there's a way in which that could be a paradigm shift in our own thinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it looks like it's 7:58. So are we sort of getting into some final thoughts here?
I would say one thing about our last question, we wrap things up. I always tell artists that art is what you do, it's not who you are. We are, as you said, we're not monolithic in our approach to life and our thinking, hopefully. I think about people like Condoleezza Rice, who's obviously one of the most brilliant people on the planet, but also a concert pianist.
Exactly. That's where I'm going with that.
So I would say, if to a parent, first of all, whatever your child wants to do, think of how they can be of service to other people.
Right.
That has been my motivation.
Right.
And my parents drilled this into me, and I think much to their chagrin, because I kept saying, look, Dad, I think I can make an impact on the world by doing music.
Yeah.
Music
and you have and are.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just a matter of picking up that instrument and letting the wind speak for you. And you have done a wonderful job of not only educating, but also entertaining, because that's what I want to go back to. I think you can do both. I don't think entertainment and education have to necessarily be separate, because we learn a lot through comedy, for example. And comedy may be perceived as entertainment, but sometimes that comedy can be satire, it can be hyperbole, it can be all that. So I want us, that is my ideal for the world, is for us to imagine the world as both and not in terms of either or, because we are multidisciplinary people. We are not single issue people. We do it all at once. I use the term edutain. Edutainment. There you go. Right. That's a Western construct if we are somehow trying to separate things artificially, because our identities aren't separated. we can be a mathematician and love to break dance or and study Shakespeare. So that's what I'm saying. It's just the restrictions of the academy and education have not allowed us to do that in a way that we felt we could do it without feeling guilty or that we were somehow giving up something, as opposed to looking at all that we bring to the table in terms of who we are and what we do.
Yes. Well, I think our time is fleeting right now. But I do want to close by saying, I hope that for those of you who've had a chance to watch this work will take away a thought of how you can make a contribution to the world, how you can live your life in such a way that you recognize other people's humanity. You know, we're dealing with a situation right now where all the hateful rhetoric being spewed by the last administration against our Asian brothers and sisters. And we're seeing that manifest itself now with people, with what happened a couple of days in Atlanta. We have to stop that. We have to be better than that. We have to be a kind of people who recognize that, as Amanda Gorman said, that democracy can work for everybody. When everyone has an opportunity to do well, we all do well. But we don't have to be in a mindset where I've got mine and I don't care if you get yours. That kind of thinking, I think it paralyzes us and it keeps us from realizing the greatness that we are capable of achieving as a nation. So I would just simply ask people to, if you listen to the words of Langston Hughes and other great writers, ask yourself, what can you do, as I said in my introduction, individually or collectively to make the world better?
Yeah. And I want to end just with Langston Hughes' words in the poem "Still Here." That's when you ask, how was I doing? And I said, I'm still here. He says, I've been scarred and battered, my hopes the wind done scattered. Snow has frizzed me, sun has baked me, looks between them. They done tried to make me stop laughing, stop loving, stop living, but I don't care because I'm still here. And with that, I thank you very much for indulging me and for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Thank you and congratulations on the work that you continue to do to inspire, to educate, and to entertain us, Professor McCurdy.
Thank you, sir. And I would just say, when Stacy called and said we want to do this, she said, well, can you think of someone to serve as moderator? You were my first and only choice. And I'm so grateful that you said yes, so thank you. I also want to thank Stacey Bailey, Michael Reed, and Tracy Mason for hosting us, and thank you for your continued support. We enjoyed this, and I look forward to maybe coming one day again to do it live back in at Arizona State. So thank you guys again for having me.
Yes, thank you, and congratulations on your many successes. We look forward to hosting you live once COVID is behind us and everybody is vaccinated and safe. Okay. All right. Good evening.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ronald C. McCurdy, Dr. Neal Lester. We love that discussion. We're definitely going to be sharing this so people can watch it. And as we mentioned at the top of the hour, you can still go back and watch the Langston Hughes Project performed by the Ron McCurdy Quartet, Ask Your Mama 12 Moods for Jazz. You can watch that at tinyurl.com/Ask Your Mama. And the password is LHP 2021. That will remain live until March 21st. So please share that with anyone that you think might enjoy the program, and go ahead and share this discussion so they can get the 1-2 punch. We loved all of the audience questions and really enjoyed this multimedia piece. And yes, completely hope that we can have this in-house again. As we said in the beginning, Charles Lewis did a wonderful job being one of the local musicians on that show. Maybe that's something that'll happen again in the future. And we really appreciate all of the questions and the wonderful, insightful comments that we got to hear tonight. We do want to tell you about another upcoming set of live streams that we have. These are both in March. Next week, our Beams live online music series rolls on. On the 25th at 7 p.m., we will have African world music artist Chinobe. He is doing really wonderful things since the pandemic kicked off. He has re-envisioned his whole setup, and instead of playing with other musicians, he has come a real long way with his live looping and sampling of all of his wonderful sacred African instruments. So kora, kalimba, there's so many different things that he has made by hand and changed kind of from the traditional way that they're made to serve the purposes that he wants. And so we'll be taking audience questions. people are always like, what's that instrument? It's a kora. And you can learn a lot about his process and how he fabricates the instruments. And he's done so many great things in schools. He did master classes, and he's performed here live at ASU Care several times, including with his Dance of Hope Children's Ensemble. And while we can't have him in the venue with an audience, he will be joining us from his super secret lair full of instruments. And we'll be able to chat with him, see what he's been up to. And his normal live streams have about 6,000 viewers. So we hope we can get at least a fraction of that and have a great chat with Chinobe. Our monthly storytelling series, Gather, will be the final Wednesday of every month. This month, that's the 31st. Those shows start at 6:30 p.m. And this month, the theme is Don't Panic. We will have 3 storytellers come and still tell stories around that theme. Our host will be Liz Warren of the South Mountain Storytelling Institute, and she is going to tell a great cultural story, a traditional story that kicks off the night. And then we will have Sister Navi Ho from the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence telling a personal story around that theme. And then Amanda Jeremiah from Tucson will be telling a story around that theme. So please tune in as you have tonight, YouTube, Facebook Live, and Twitch, and go ahead and hit that subscribe button on YouTube. We would love to have you watch our future streams, and you'll get notifications when we go live, so you will be sure not to miss those. Thanks again to all of our viewers, Dr. Ronald C. McCurdy, Dr. Neal Lester. This was fun. This was wonderful, interesting. And we're going to go back and watch the Langston Hughes Project again. Have a great night.